The morning sun spilled across the marble floors of Atlantic National Bank, casting long streaks of golden light as Sarah Carter stepped through the grand revolving doors. At 34, Sarah was a woman of quiet strength. She wore comfortable gray sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt, not because she lacked means, but because she valued purpose over appearance. Her natural curls framed a warm, thoughtful face. There was nothing flashy about her. No designer purse. No expensive jewelry. Just a small leather folder tucked under her arm and a sense of calm resolve in her stride. Walking beside her was her husband, Daniel Carter, dressed in a sharply tailored navy blue suit. His platinum watch peeked out from beneath his cuff, subtle, yet unmistakably high-end. At 42, Daniel had built Carter Capital Group into one of the nation's most respected investment firms. Despite his immense success, Daniel carried himself with humility. He and Sarah had always agreed to lead a grounded life, even as their bank accounts soared into the hundreds of millions. "You sure you want to handle this on your own?" Daniel asked as he checked his smartwatch, knowing he had a call with his Singapore office in just a few minutes. "Absolutely," Sarah replied with a reassuring smile. She squeezed his hand gently. "I've always managed the foundation's finances myself." "That was our deal, remember?" Daniel nodded. It was true. From the very start, Sarah had run the Carter Educational Foundation independently, her passion project devoted to helping underprivileged children learn to read and thrive. Today's visit was for a new initiative they were launching, one that required setting up a separate account in person due to recent changes in nonprofit banking regulations. Daniel took a seat in the sleek lobby, earbuds in, beginning his call. Sarah made her way to the customer service counter. Even as they entered together, the reactions they drew couldn't have been more different. Employees straightened at the sight of Daniel's polished appearance. But Sarah? She got polite, puzzled glances, some barely concealing their assumptions. Still, Sarah remained unfazed. She'd walked into many rooms where people didn't expect someone like her to be the one holding the check. She was used to being underestimated. And yet, nothing about this visit felt threatening, at least not yet. As she approached the desk, she spotted the nameplate, Rebecca Scott, Customer Service Manager. The woman behind it had a picture-perfect appearance, immaculate blonde hair, crisp white blouse, and a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sarah took a breath, ready to complete what she thought would be a routine transaction. "Good morning," she said kindly, placing her folder gently on the counter. "I'd like to make a deposit and open a new account, please." Neither of them knew that within the next few minutes, this simple request would turn into a moment of public judgment, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of this bank. Behind the counter at Atlantic National Bank, Rebecca Scott sat upright, her back perfectly straight, the tension in her shoulders masked by years of practiced poise. Her blonde hair was styled in a flawless bob, and her makeup, though slightly overdone, was applied with precision. From the outside, she looked like the picture of professional success. But inside, her morning had started on a bitter note. The promotion she'd been working toward for over 3 years had been given to someone else, someone from another branch with less experience, in her opinion. Rebecca had plastered on her usual smile, but her eyes were still red from the tears she'd fought back in the car that morning. She wasn't in the mood for surprises. So when she looked up and saw Sarah Carter, a black woman in sweatpants and sneakers, walking toward her counter with what looked like an old leather folder, Rebecca made a snap judgment. Sarah didn't look like the usual clientele at Atlantic National. This wasn't the kind of place that welcomed just anyone off the street. The bank, located in the heart of Boston's financial district, served high net worth individuals, corporate executives, legacy families, people with summer homes on Martha's Vineyard. "Good morning," Sarah greeted warmly. "I'd like to make a deposit and open a new account." Rebecca didn't return the warmth. Her tone was neutral, bordering on cool. "Do you currently have an account with us?" "No, this would be a new relationship," Sarah replied, opening her folder to reveal a check. "It's for the Carter Educational Foundation. We're launching a new program that requires a separate account." Rebecca's eyes flicked to the check and widened slightly. The amount was significant, $250,000. But instead of being impressed, she grew suspicious. She didn't reach for the check. "That's quite a sum," Rebecca said, eyebrows raised. "May I ask where these funds came from?" Sarah remained calm. "From our annual fundraiser. All the supporting documents are here, including our 501(c)(3) certification." Customers nearby had started to glance over. Rebecca's voice had just enough volume to carry. "I'm sorry," she said louder, "but we don't usually open accounts of this size without more thorough verification." Sarah's cheeks flushed, but her tone stayed steady. "Our CFO called ahead to confirm the process. We were told everything we needed is in this folder." Rebecca leaned slightly forward, her voice sharper now. "Ms. Carter, Atlantic National serves a particular kind of clientele. Our high net worth customers expect a certain standard of environment." Her eyes dropped pointedly to Sarah's outfit. The implication hung in the air like a bad smell. Sarah was stunned, not by the rejection, but by how openly it was delivered. A few customers paused their transactions. A young teller behind the counter looked increasingly uncomfortable. "I'm not convinced this is the right banking relationship for someone of your profile," Rebecca added flatly. It was more than a dismissal. It was a judgment, based not on facts, but on fabric. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah Carter found herself feeling small in a room where she had come only to serve others. Across the grand lobby of Atlantic National Bank, Daniel Carter had just wrapped up his international call. He slid his phone into his pocket and glanced toward the customer service area, only to find something deeply unsettling. His wife, Sarah, stood rigid at the counter, her expression tense. And behind the desk, a blonde bank manager, Rebecca Scott, he'd later learn, was pointing her finger in a way that could only be described as dismissive. Several customers had stopped to watch. The air carried the quiet discomfort of a situation going from awkward to shameful. Daniel didn't move hastily. Years of high-stakes negotiation had taught him the power of controlled pacing. He crossed the polished marble floor with quiet purpose, his presence alone causing a subtle ripple. A security guard adjusted his stance. A teller whispered something to a colleague. People noticed when Daniel Carter entered a room, even when he said nothing at all. He caught just enough of Rebecca's voice as he approached. "I suggest you take your supposedly charitable donations elsewhere. This institution has standards." Sarah didn't see him yet, but her face had gone pale with embarrassment. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the folder. Daniel's heart tightened. Not because his wife had been insulted, but because he knew exactly how much she had given to children, families, and schools, how hard she worked to lift others up, all while refusing to put herself in the spotlight. "Is there a problem here?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. Rebecca turned sharply, clearly annoyed at the interruption, until her eyes registered the tailored suit, the commanding posture, and the kind of confidence that wasn't taught in business school. Her irritation melted into forced politeness. "Sir," she began, flashing a professional smile, "this customer and I were..." "She's not a customer," Daniel said evenly. "She's my wife." Silence swept through the lobby like a gust of wind. Rebecca blinked. "Your wife?" Daniel nodded, stepping beside Sarah and placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sarah Carter, founder of the Carter Educational Foundation. She's here to deposit funds for our new literacy program. I believe you were questioning that deposit." Rebecca's face drained of color. Her eyes darted between Sarah's casual attire and Daniel's expensive watch as the full weight of her mistake dawned on her. A young associate, standing a few feet away, instinctively took a step back, realizing this wasn't just an awkward exchange, it was a turning point. I wasn't aware," Rebecca stammered. "That," Sarah said quietly, finding her voice again, "is the problem." The room remained hushed. What had begun as a routine banking errand was now a public reckoning, one that would soon rise all the way to the top floors of Atlantic National Bank. Moments after the confrontation, a tall man in a navy suit appeared from the mezzanine level above the lobby. Walter Blake, president of Atlantic National Bank, had been watching the commotion from his glass-walled office. The second he recognized Daniel Carter, one of the bank's most valued clients, he made his way swiftly down the stairs. "Mr. Carter," he said, extending a hand, his voice marked by concern, "this is an unexpected visit." Daniel accepted the handshake with a curt nod. "I wish I could say the same. My wife was just publicly humiliated by one of your senior staff members." Blake's eyes flicked to Rebecca Scott, who stood frozen, her face pale, lips parted but silent. The lobby was still buzzing, whispers, stunned expressions, even a few phone cameras discreetly raised. "Would you both join me in the conference room?" Blake asked. "I believe this deserves a more private conversation." Behind the frosted glass doors of a quiet corner office, the atmosphere shifted from spectacle to seriousness. Tasteful artwork depicting Boston's historical landmarks lined the walls. A carafe of water sat untouched on the polished oak table. Blake remained standing, a sign of both urgency and discomfort. "First," he began, "please accept my sincere apology for what just occurred. This goes far beyond a single interaction. It reflects a cultural issue within our institution that must be addressed." Daniel's expression was calm, but resolute. "Walter, you and I have had a working relationship for 15 years. During that time, Carter Capital has directed dozens of clients to Atlantic National. I'd estimate that translates to nearly $1 billion in assets." Blake nodded, visibly aware of the magnitude of what was at stake. Daniel continued, "My wife wasn't mistreated because she's my wife. She was mistreated because she didn't look like she belonged here. And I guarantee she's not the first person to experience that at your bank." Sarah leaned forward, her tone gentle but direct. "Mr. Blake, I'm not here to demand special treatment or immediate apology. I want to know what happens tomorrow when another woman, maybe Latina, maybe wearing scrubs after a shift, walks in to deposit a check from her nonprofit. Will she be treated with respect? Or judged by her clothing and skin tone?" Blake listened, his demeanor shifting from defensive to reflective. "What would you suggest?" he finally asked. Sarah didn't hesitate. "Start with comprehensive training for every employee, top to bottom. Make respect a non-negotiable policy. And partner with our foundation to help create real pathways into the financial industry for young people from underserved communities." Daniel added quietly, "And Rebecca?" Blake responded without hesitation. "She's been removed from client-facing roles effective immediately. Her future with us will depend on whether she shows a real understanding of the harm she caused, not just to Sarah, but to our institution's values." Outside the room, the bank was still humming, but change had already begun to take root. Back out on the main floor of Atlantic National Bank, the mood had shifted. The air, once thick with quiet judgment, now carried something different: curiosity, discomfort, and a lingering sense that something important had just happened. As Sarah and Daniel Carter sat in the conference room with Walter Blake, another employee was quietly stepping into his own moment of truth. Ethan Brooks, a junior associate in his mid-20s, had been behind the counter when the entire confrontation unfolded. He had seen the way Rebecca Scott spoke to Sarah, her dismissive tone, the pointed finger, the subtle yet unmistakable suggestion that Sarah didn't belong. Ethan had also seen the expressions on the faces of other employees: awkward glances, nervous smiles, eyes darting away. But Ethan hadn't forgotten something else. When he first joined the bank, his younger sister had been struggling in school. She was 10 at the time, bright but unable to read at her grade level. His parents were overwhelmed and scared. Then one day, someone handed them a brochure from the Carter Educational Foundation. It led them to a free literacy program just 3 blocks from their home. Within a year, his sister was reading full chapter books. She even wrote an essay that was published in the local paper. So when Ethan saw Sarah Carter being treated like a nobody, it struck a personal nerve. Now, as Rebecca emerged from the conference room, clearly shaken, Ethan made a choice. He stepped forward, gently intercepting Sarah before she left the room. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice respectful but steady, "if you'll allow me, I'd be honored to complete the setup for your foundation's new account." Sarah looked at him, really looked. There was no fear or hesitation in his expression, just sincerity. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm. Ethan sat with her at a desk tucked into a quieter corner. He handled each document with care, making sure every detail matched what was needed. As he printed the final confirmation form, he hesitated, then spoke. "My sister," he began, glancing up, "she was part of your reading program last year. Her name's Lily. Before she found your foundation, she hated school. Now, she carries a book in her backpack everywhere she goes." Sarah's eyes softened. "What's her favorite book?" "She's obsessed with Charlotte's Web right now," Ethan said with a quiet chuckle. "She even cried when Charlotte died." Sarah smiled, a full, genuine smile that reached her eyes. That story changed a lot of hearts. Before she could respond further, Walter Blake stepped out of the conference room and nodded toward Ethan. "I see you've taken initiative." Ethan stood. "It felt like the right thing to do, sir." Blake nodded slowly, as if seeing Ethan in a new light. It was. At that moment, something small but significant shifted. A young man had chosen empathy over silence. And a banking institution had just gained a glimpse of what its future could look like if it truly listened. The door to the conference room eased open with a soft click. Rebecca Scott stepped out first, her posture stiff, her face pale. She held her shoulders back as though trying to preserve what dignity she had left, but the redness around her eyes betrayed the emotional weight she carried. Moments earlier, she'd sat across from the president of the bank and one of the most influential financial figures in Boston. She had been forced to confront the consequences of a moment she thought would pass unnoticed, just another routine judgment, as she'd told herself. But this moment would change everything. Sarah Carter, still composed, emerged behind her, followed by Daniel and Walter Blake. The lobby quieted again, not from shock this time, but from awareness. Something meaningful had just taken place behind closed doors, and its impact was already visible. Rebecca lingered near the exit, unsure whether she was expected to stay or go. She felt exposed, like the foundation she'd built her career upon, control, image, protocol, had suddenly crumbled. It was then that she saw Ethan Brooks at his desk, finishing up the paperwork for Sarah's foundation. As she passed by, she stopped hesitantly. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely audible above the hum of printers and murmured conversations. "Your sister, she wrote that piece in the Boston Chronicle last month, didn't she? The one about learning to read?" Ethan looked up, surprised. "Yes, that was Lily." Rebecca swallowed. "My son, he struggles too. With reading. I clipped that article and saved it." It was a moment of unexpected vulnerability. For once, Rebecca wasn't trying to impress or explain, she was just a mother, worried for her child. Across the lobby, Sarah noticed the exchange. A beat later, she walked over, calm but purposeful. "Mrs. Carter," Rebecca began quickly, voice tight, "I can't undo what I said earlier. I was wrong. Deeply wrong." Sarah studied her. "No," she said softly, "you can't undo it. But I heard what you said to Ethan just now." Rebecca's eyes flickered. "I don't expect forgiveness." "I'm not offering that," Sarah replied. "But I am offering something else." She reached into her purse and pulled out a simple business card. "We're holding a workshop next Thursday for parents of children with learning differences. You should come." Rebecca took the card slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. "You'd be okay with me showing up, after everything?" "Your son deserves every chance," Sarah said. "Judgment is easy. Compassion is harder. But it's never too late to start choosing the harder path." For the first time all morning, Rebecca's expression softened. She wasn't just a bank manager anymore. She was a mother, being handed a second chance, not just for her son, but for herself. As Sarah turned to walk away, Daniel met her with a proud smile. "You didn't just stand up for yourself," he whispered, "you reached back to lift someone else." Sarah nodded. "Everyone's fighting a battle we can't see. Sometimes, the real power is in choosing grace." In the weeks that followed, the echoes of that unforgettable morning at Atlantic National Bank did not fade, they deepened. What had begun as an act of prejudice and humiliation grew into something far larger, a reckoning, then a reformation. Walter Blake, the bank's president, wasted no time. True to the promise he made behind closed doors, he initiated a full review of internal policies. Staff at every level, from junior tellers to senior executives, underwent comprehensive training focused on unconscious bias, customer dignity, and ethical service. It wasn't a PowerPoint seminar or a one-time workshop. It was the start of something deeper, a cultural shift. But Walter knew training alone wasn't enough. Change had to be visible, and it had to be lived. That's why, within 2 months, Atlantic National launched its newest initiative, the Community Banking Partnership Program. Designed in collaboration with Sarah Carter's Educational Foundation, the program aimed to open financial access to nonprofit organizations, community projects, and underserved groups that had traditionally been overlooked or undervalued. The program didn't just adjust policies. It eliminated unnecessary hurdles for small nonprofits opening accounts. It assigned dedicated representatives for grassroots leaders. And it gave every customer the same level of respect, whether depositing $250 or $250,000. At the heart of it all was a new title, Director of Community Outreach, and it was offered to none other than Ethan Brooks. When Walter called Ethan into his office to offer him the role, the young man was stunned. "I'm just a junior associate," Ethan said, eyes wide. "You were," Walter replied. "But you saw a moment for justice and acted. That's the kind of leadership this bank needs now." Ethan accepted with a humility that mirrored the foundation Sarah had built, service without spotlight, impact without ego. The results came quickly. Within 6 weeks, the community banking partnership had formed active collaborations with 27 local organizations, ranging from food banks to youth mentorship programs. One literacy nonprofit that had nearly shut down due to banking fees was now thriving thanks to a fee waiver and dedicated support. The bank's public image also began to shift. Stories were picked up by local news outlets, not as public relations fluff, but as proof that transformation was possible, even in the most buttoned-up institutions. And through it all, Sarah Carter remained focused, not on accolades, but on accountability. "This isn't charity," she said during an early press interview. "It's correction. Financial institutions don't just hold money, they hold influence. And influence must be used with care." Across the city, parents who once felt intimidated walking into a marble-floored bank now entered with confidence, knowing that someone like Sarah had helped pave the way. Inside Atlantic National, portraits of past presidents still lined the walls. But now, new banners hung beside them, showcasing community projects, student art from literacy programs, and testimonials from families who once felt invisible. Change, it turned out, didn't start with a press release. It started with one woman refusing to shrink in the face of judgment, and one institution willing to admit it needed to grow. 6 months had passed since Sarah Carter walked into Atlantic National Bank wearing sweatpants and carrying a check for $250,000. What started as a moment of judgment had since grown into a movement, one that reshaped not only a bank's culture, but the lives of countless families who had once been overlooked. On a brisk fall afternoon, Sarah stood at the podium of a packed auditorium in downtown Boston. Behind her, a presentation screen displayed images from the newly launched Community Banking Partnership Program, food co-ops, after-school literacy centers, mobile health clinics, all funded in part through the financial pathways the initiative had created. Sarah wore a simple navy dress and flats. She still refused to chase labels or appearances. Her strength had never been about what she wore. It came from who she was and what she stood for. Real change, she told the audience of parents, educators, nonprofit leaders, and financial professionals, happens when opportunity meets accountability. In the front row, Walter Blake listened intently. He'd changed too. No longer just the president of a prestigious bank, he had become an advocate for equity, spearheading reforms many once thought impossible in such a traditional institution. Beside him sat Daniel Carter, beaming with quiet pride as he watched his wife speak with grace and clarity. Her voice filled the room, not loud, but full of conviction. 3 rows behind them sat someone who, at one time, never imagined herself part of this world, Rebecca Scott. She had taken a long, hard look in the mirror after that day at the bank. What followed were months of learning, listening, and letting go of the rigid need to control everything, especially people. She attended that first workshop Sarah invited her to, then another. Eventually, she volunteered. Before long, she became one of the foundation's most passionate advocates, particularly for parents navigating learning challenges with their children. Now, she stood quietly in line after the event, holding a small manila folder. When it was her turn, she stepped up to Sarah and opened it with care. "My son's latest reading assessment," she said. "He's gone up 3 grade levels since the Foundation's program." Sarah looked at the results, then up at Rebecca with a soft smile. "He's making wonderful progress." Rebecca hesitated, then added, "I think about that day at the bank often. About how quickly I judged you. How small I made you feel. And now you see," Sarah prompted gently. Rebecca nodded. "Now I see it wasn't you who didn't belong that day, it was me. Not because of how I looked, but because of how I acted. And I'm grateful that moment became my turning point." Sarah reached out and gently touched her arm. Sometimes the most powerful transformations begin when we realize we were wrong. That evening, as Sarah and Daniel walked hand in hand through the community garden they had helped plant years ago, golden light filtered through tall stalks of kale and late-blooming marigolds. The air was crisp with the scent of soil and change. "You didn't just ask for justice that day," Daniel said quietly. "You created a new path for everyone." Sarah nodded, eyes on the winding garden paths. "One person at a time," she said. "One assumption challenged at a time." As we grow older, life teaches us that appearances often tell only a fraction of the story, and sometimes, the most meaningful truths are hidden behind simple clothes and quiet voices. The story of Sarah Carter reminds us that dignity is not worn, it's lived. In a world that increasingly judges worth by wealth, status, and outward image, this narrative challenges us to look deeper. One of the most powerful lessons here is the importance of seeing people for who they are, not what they were or where they come from. Sarah, despite facing judgment, chose not to retaliate with anger but with grace, using the moment not just to defend herself but to plant seeds of change. That's the kind of strength that isn't taught in school or found in titles. It's shaped by life, by experience, and by wisdom. For those of us in our later years, this story is a reminder that we still have the power to influence hearts and systems, whether through mentoring younger generations, supporting fair treatment in our communities, or simply by modeling compassion in everyday life. Another message is that it's never too late to change, as Rebecca's journey shows. Even those who've made mistakes can grow, evolve, and become powerful advocates for good. Ultimately, this story encourages us to leave behind a legacy of respect, empathy, and transformation, not just through our words, but through our actions. Because true wealth isn't found in bank accounts. It's found in how we treat others, especially those who can offer us nothing in return.